Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for your time, taking time to listen. We so appreciate it. And we also appreciate your support. If you'd like to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, you can do so by going to jeffersonhour.com. And you can also find a schedule of Clay's personal appearances, his cultural tours, his online classes at jeffersonhour.com. Having said all of that, this week we talked to President Jefferson about the Constitution. It was really an interesting conversation.
Jefferson wasn't there. He was in Europe between 1784 and 1789, so he missed the preliminary Annapolis Convention, which collapsed, and he missed the Constitutional Convention. Also missing was John Adams, who would have been a really interesting figure at the Constitutional Convention. Probably we are blessed by not having either of them there, frankly, because Adams would have talked all the time, and he was one of the world's leading experts on constitutions. He had written a massive history of the constitutions of the United States, and he would have held forth because he would have deserved to hold forth, but it would have been a much more tedious experience probably, and he would not have suffered fools very well. And Jefferson, it's, I think, fortunate that he wasn't there, David, because Jefferson is a utopian, and he's also a big advocate of the Articles of Confederation, and he didn't realize how broken they were, and he didn't realize that it really was necessary to basically to start over. And he would have been calling for limited government. He would have been talking about the anarchy of Native Americans. And, Jefferson would have been a distraction in another way, although a brilliant one. So those two great men were not there. And Benjamin Franklin, who was there, played a really minor role. Of course, he got the big moment at the end when they finish and the woman says to him, what have you given us? And he says, a republic, if you can keep it. So he got in some good bits, but he didn't play a substantive role in the formation, nor did George Washington.
That didn't come up during the program. Why wasn't Adams there?
Adams was the ambassador in England.
At that time.
Yeah, so both of them were out of the country. But I mean, Jefferson might not have even agreed to go. He would have, as usual, sent his draft from the mountain in Madison's hands. He would have been a nuisance, I think, to Madison.
Adams would have gone, though.
Adams would have gone. Oh my, he would have gone, and he would have
missed that.
In the famous musical 1776, they keep saying, "Sit down, John, sit down," and you would have had that. And there would have been just like people would be. Oh, he's up. He's going to give a 2-hour speech about the Greek leagues or attempts in the Netherlands to create a constitutional system, and people would have just rolled their eyes. But on the other hand, it is literally the case that nobody who could have been there knew more about constitutions than John Adams, and it would have been, I think, a very different constitution in some respects had he been there.
Well, let's go to the conversation. Anything you want to speak about before we do?
Just that I love this subject, and you kind of slightly caught me off guard by suggesting this, but I was just struck by how much data just rattles around my head, but how much I love this subject. I've done 3 constitutional courses in the last year online, and even though the pandemic is ending, I'm going to continue to do them, and the next one comes in November, and people can sign up. There'll be several sections. I want to keep doing it. I think we're weak. We're weak in civics in this country, and we've been through this 5-year period where we really saw some tests of the Constitution, and the guardrails held, but barely. And I think that we need to address this both as individuals to get up to speed, but also to address this as a society, that it's in our interest now to strengthen the guardrails. After Watergate, we strengthened the American system to make sure that sort of thing might not happen again. And now that we've had another really serious constitutional crisis, sometimes of great magnitude and sometimes of more frivolous magnitude, but it's been gigantic. It's in our interest to know what's at stake here and how power gets transferred and what the Electoral College does or shouldn't do and what's the difference between federal authority and state and local authority and so on and so forth. So people can sign up for that by going to jeffersonhour.com. My book, The Language of Cottonwood's Essays on the Future of North Dakota is doing very well. I'm getting some wonderful public and private feedback for it. And there are other books and things there, so people can go. And the cultural tours, of course, the next big one is Steinbeck in March. We want to really have a full tour of Steinbeck's California, including an short add-on trip where we go up to Tehachapi Pass and we gaze down into the Garden of Eden that the Jodes saw when they got there in the Grapes of Wrath. So all of that is coming. David, it's been a really, really exciting time in my life, and I've been so fortunate to have you and the Jefferson Hour and the students of these online courses, because they've gotten me deeper into the constitutional questions than I have ever been in my life, and I'm very thankful.
I find it for myself very grounding to speak to President Jefferson whenever I get the chance.
Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and it's good to see you again, Mr. Jefferson.
Good to see you, sir.
Mr. Jefferson, I'd like to speak with you this week about the Constitution, its creation, and your level of support for the document. I thought perhaps we could start with some historical context, and I'm certain that, sir, you can help me with this. After the end of the Revolutionary War, America was governed by the Articles of Confederation, which gave the Confederation Congress the power to create rules and request funds from the states. The problem is that it lacked any enforcement powers. Congress couldn't regulate commerce or even print money, and added to that were serious disputes between states over issues from taxation to trade.
Yes, indeed. There were problems, both real and perceived, in the Articles of Confederation, which were adopted as a war measure. These 13 colonies suddenly became independent states, and they didn't know whether to consider themselves sovereign nation states like France and Russia, or whether to be subordinate to a larger national authority. But in the short term, before that question really had to be faced in full measure, we had to come together to coordinate our military response to Britain, to have some sort of a currency system, to keep states from pursuing independence in ways that canceled out each other's efforts, and so on. And so we created a wartime measure, the Articles of Confederation. And at the time we created it, sir, we were so averse to centralized authority, and particularly to a monarchy, that we created a very loose confederation of sovereign constituent states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina, and so on, 13 of them. There was not a strong executive. There was a requirement of unanimity or near unanimity for almost all measures under the Confederation system, and amending the Constitution would require unanimous consent of all 13 states, which could never occur. And as you say, there were great difficulties in regulating commerce between the states and having a uniform commercial policy with respect to Europe. So we all knew that we needed to make some adjustments to the Articles of Confederation. I believe that a few carefully targeted amendments could fix it, because I like the loose federation. I like the idea that Virginia is a nation state, a sovereign unto itself, which happens to engage cooperatively with other sovereigns like Pennsylvania or New Hampshire. But I was out of the country, as you know, when the new Constitution was written, and the men who met there, most of them at least, wanted a much more strong and centralized national government than the Articles had provided. And so they scratched what I called the good old venerable fabric of the Articles of Confederation and began again and produced a Constitution in 1787. I was not a member of that convention, and the result, and I know we'll speak to this, was a stronger and more centralized government than I was fully comfortable with.
How did the convention come about? Who initiated it?
My closest friend, James Madison, was a central figure in this, and it actually had to do with Madison and, of all people, Alexander Hamilton. In the previous year, 1786, aware of these very severe commercial difficulties that were making it essentially impossible for us to behave as a nation. There was a small convention held in Annapolis, Maryland, which was to address the commercial issues. It failed to have a quorum. States were invited, but only a handful turned up. It collapsed, and Hamilton and Madison were both there, and they realized that we were in real jeopardy as a new nation, that we had at least to fix the commercial provisions of the Articles of Confederation, or we couldn't go on, that we would literally fall apart as a national entity, and who knows what that would mean. And so then they proposed another meeting the following May in Philadelphia, not Annapolis, and this time they worked much harder to convince the states to arrive, and the way they managed to do it, sir, was to persuade and convince, finally, George Washington to attend. He did not wish to attend for a number of reasons. They knew that they had a slim chance of getting a new constitution or even a quorum without Washington's presence. But if they could announce that George Washington had agreed to come and presumably preside over the thing, that the chances that some of the recalcitrant states would appear was much more likely. They worked very hard on this, and it took an enormous amount of persuasion and pressure and cajoling and flattery and even some aggression on the part of Hamilton and Madison and others to convince George Washington to agree to attend. But when he did, this not only secured a quorum, every state came except Rhode Island, it meant that there was a weight and seriousness to the deliberations that probably would not have been there had he not participated.
I'm wondering, sir, people who were opposed to this, what would the outcome have been? We would have ended up a group of nation states not unlike Europe.
Or worse, because we didn't have any traditions, no institutions, no history, our economy was brand new. We had no national defense system, and each state would then have been expected to provide its own defense, its own navy, its own militia system or army. The fact is that several of the states were in dispute over commercial questions and taxation and trade policy, and there were even minor shooting wars on the borders of several states in the lead up to this. And so the system just wasn't working. If there had been no constitutional convention, had we tried to labor on with the articles, I'm sure that those responsible would have attempted to get key amendments, and the amendments would have been in a commercial nature, but also about taxation, because one of the really significant flaws of the Articles of Confederation was that it did not have enforceable tax policy. So if the Congress could come to terms with what kind of revenues they needed, and they would apportion it according to the populations and wealth of the individual states, then they would request of the state of South Carolina to send in X $100,000 or X $1 million. But there was no way to compel South Carolina to do that, and many states didn't. And so the Confederation Congress was perennially starved for funds and never knew where the revenues would come. If nothing had come about from the Philadelphia Convention, if it too had collapsed as Annapolis had the previous year, states like Virginia would have found a way to go on, of course. We were the biggest state and the most populous state. But a number of the states would have been in really difficult trouble. Here was the concern of people like Madison and Hamilton. In desperation, they might have turned to England and said, we'd like to be reconnected to the British Empire. We'd like to undo the independence movement and become a crown colony again, so that we would have the assurance of the British Navy and all of the advantages of the British mercantile system and its economy. And so there was real concern, or maybe some of the states would have turned elsewhere, to France or to Poland or Russia. The question was, will the gravity of the situation persuade and compel these states to find a method to rebuild a stronger constitution? And as everybody knows, not without extraordinary difficulties in that summer in Philadelphia, and times when it nearly fell apart, several times. In the end, they did manage to produce a new constitution, and although I'm not one of its most ardent admirers, it did manage to solve some of the problems that existed and enabled us to go on.
Sir, you mentioned a meeting in Annapolis, I believe it was, that was poorly attended. And I must ask the question, What level of support existed for a constitutional convention at that time?
Well, in 1786, I don't think perhaps people understood what the convention in Annapolis was going to accomplish. Its mission was very small. There was no suggestion that this meeting was going to address the whole set of weaknesses or perceived weaknesses of the Constitution. I don't think that it was, to use a term from your time, that it was marketed very well. It failed. But the amazing thing is that Madison and Hamilton did not despair. They easily could have. But they thought, no, we'll regroup and we'll do something bolder. And that bolder thing will be not in Annapolis, but Philadelphia, and we will get Washington to commit. And if we can get Washington to commit and then use his massive reputation and authority to get the word out to all of the 13 states, there's a very good chance this time that we will achieve a quorum and be able to pursue a stronger Constitution. Now, when they planned the Philadelphia Convention, they did not intend to scrap the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. They planned to fix what was weak in it. But when they all arrived, and they didn't all come at the same time, it took until June for some of the states to show up, but when they began to arrive in mid-May 1787, and they got enough for a quorum, then Mr. Madison's plan, which became known as the Virginia Plan, was put forth, and that scrapped the entire Articles of Confederation and began with a blank slate to create a new constitution. And that, surprisingly, was accepted without great controversy. You need to understand that several of these states sent their delegates to Philadelphia with explicit instructions to do only that which was required to patch the fabric of the Articles of Confederation back together. They were not given the authority to erase and rescind the Articles and start again. When they did that, when the delegates in Philadelphia chose to do that very early on in the deliberations, they were exceeding the authority that they had gained from their home states, and several of them were aware of it and knew that they would be in some jeopardy politically for taking so drastic a step.
It really must be looked upon as an extraordinary achievement.
It's an achievement that they were able to come together at all. It's an even greater achievement that they convinced Washington to come, because he thought he had retired once and for all. He was the American Cincinnatus, and when Cincinnatus retires, he doesn't come back. If he comes back, it means he's ambitious. It means that he's not done wanting to serve or preside. And so Washington feared that all of the reputation that he had built up as being a man above politics, a man who did not require power, a man who wanted only to do the right thing for his country and then retire, as he liked to put it, under his vine and his fig trees. When Washington was asked to come and be part of this, he realized that he could be jeopardizing that historical reputation, and that people would shrug cynically and say, well, we thought so, this is exactly what you would expect. Getting him there was a huge step for the progress of the United States.
We're going to take a short break from this conversation. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. The plan, as you said, of the Constitutional Convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation, not to replace them. But in fact, the delegates did come up with a completely new document, which really, to me, was an extraordinary achievement. If I could bring you to my time, sir, a phrase that we often hear from politicians now is the search for bipartisanship. In other words, the two opposing parties coming together, and there's so much give and take that has to occur for that to succeed. The delegates of the Constitutional Convention had to balance their loyalty to individual home states with a need for a more powerful central government.
There were no political parties at the time. So your concerns in your era of very pronounced partisanship and mutual distrust between these political parties did not exist in my time. These were all patriots who had distinguished themselves in their home states. Some of them had signed the Declaration of Independence. Many of them had served in state legislatures. Almost all of them were political veterans of one sort or another. A number of them had fought in the war. they came without partisan connections. However, it soon became clear that there were some very significant fissures. And the one that gets the most attention is between the big states and the small states. So you have a big state like Virginia, the largest state, the most populous state, at the same convention as a tiny state like Delaware. And the little states felt that they were better off under the Articles of Confederation, in which each state had one vote, than they would be under a new constitutional system where they feared that the large states would simply swallow up the small ones or band together in ways that were not favorable to the interests and the needs of the small states. And so the small states put up a very strong resistance to a stronger national government, and they were able to get away with it. They basically offered to walk out on a number of occasions if their status as sovereign states were not protected on something like an equal basis with the big states. This led to some very serious quarreling and some deep mistrust, and there were sharp words exchanged both on the convention floor and in the taverns. And at one point, it looked as if the thing would break down. But then something known as the Great Compromise occurred, and that's what gave you the current Senate. So the compromise was that the states would be proportionally represented in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate, and this was the insistence, the ultimatum of the small states. In the Senate, every state would get 2 senators, and therefore Delaware would have the same number of senators as Virginia or Pennsylvania. Mr. Madison was very upset by this compromise. He felt that we needed proportional representation in both houses. He thought that this could be the ruin of the new Constitution, that this might be a fatal flaw. The small states were so powerful, sir, that they managed to get language into the final document that said this provision of 2 senators for every state could never be altered without the explicit endorsement of a state. So in other words, if, let's say 99% of the country agreed to change the formula for the Senate, and they came to Delaware and said, every other state agrees to change the formula, what about you? Delaware could say, no, we refuse, and they would be constitutionally protected. That was a clause that was placed into the final document at the insistence of the small states because they felt that over time they might be overwhelmed by a popular majority in the House of Representatives. So you can see how strongly they felt about it. That was the first fissure, but Madison was really the smartest person there, and that's saying something. He was with Alexander Hamilton, after all, and other very brilliant men. Madison later said, no, the actual fissure at the convention is not between large states and small. It may seem that way today, but in the long run, the real division in American life is going to be between North and South, and that division is going to be exacerbated, maybe made possible by slavery, that slavery was going to be the issue, and slavery was huddled in the South. It was already on the road to extinction in the North, already gone in many northern states. And Madison felt that this issue, this sectional issue, that the South was going to be adamant about perpetuating slavery, was not only going to be the most important issue at the Constitutional Convention, and it proved to be, but that it was going to be one of the most important issues in American constitutional history, which indeed was also the case.
As you know, Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Madison's Journal of the Federal Convention is the surviving record of the convention. It does provide tremendous insight into the thoughts of the delegates and the difficulties they faced in crafting this document. It also shows Mr. Madison's brilliance as a politician and statesman.
It does indeed. They had a secretary. They nominated and confirmed a secretary, but he proved to be mediocre at best. His journal is little more than a recording of key votes. Madison, who really is more responsible for the Constitution than any other single person, it's his Constitution in many respects. The Virginia Plan that was outlined early on in the first week was Madison's work. He took a chair in the front, as close to the dais as he could. He determined from the beginning that he would make extensive notes about the deliberations, and he did so. And he actually said later that it nearly killed him because he was taking down as much as one could without shorthand, the verbatim speeches and comments of all of the delegates. And so imagine this, that delegates are speaking up, sometimes talking over each other, some people giving long speeches. Hamilton eventually gave a 5-hour address on June 18th. And Madison is sitting there at his desk listening and scribbling as fast as he can to get down everything that was said. And when he couldn't get down the exact speech word for word, he made paraphrases of it that are highly representational of what actually occurred. And in addition to that, then when he would go home at the end of a long and exhausting day, he then would revise his journal notes from the day to remember more details of what somebody said, to make sure his penmanship was legible, to transcribe what he had written in haste into a more polished form. And so he spent his nights and weekends toning this thing up. And by the end of the Constitutional Convention in mid-September of 1787, he had produced what essentially is a transcript. If you had an actual transcript, it would be longer and it would probably be less grammatical. But he produced as close to a transcript as it was possible for a human being to produce who was not an expert in shorthand or some other court notation in 1787. And we are so benefited by this for several reasons, sir. One is that we know what went on there. The journal itself just tells us the results of voting tallies, what happened on what day, with no commentary whatsoever and no attempt to get down what debates occurred. And secondly, you have the Constitution, which consists of just over 4,000 words. It's a very short document. But Madison's commentary provides the next best thing. If you're trying to figure out what a difficult or ambiguous clause means, if you want more than just the bare and stark bones of the Constitution, which is silent on many issues, then you go next to Madison's Journal to find out what's the problem they were trying to solve and what were the various views of how to solve that problem. It's the next best thing, and in some ways better than the Constitution itself when you try to interpret it. And the third best thing is the Federalist Papers, but they came later.
I'm not certain, sir, that the Madisons Journal of the Federal Convention was even available to you during your time, but if I could, I'll read a short portion from the introduction that Mr. Madison wrote.
It was not available to me. I knew of it, but he did not allow it to be published until after his death because he did not want to publish it while any person who was there was still alive. He didn't want to offend anybody or to possibly mischaracterize them or to open old wounds.
In the introduction, Mr. Madison writes, "As the weakness and wants of man naturally lead to an association of individuals under a common authority, whereby each may have the protection of the whole against danger from without and enjoy in safety within the advantages of social intercourse and an exchange of the necessaries and comforts of life. In like manner, feeble communities, independent of each other, have resorted to a union, less intimate, but with common counsels, for the common safety against powerful neighbors, and for the preservation of justice and peace among themselves." Brilliantly written, wouldn't you say, sir?
Yes, Madison was a great prose stylist. He was a deep student of law and constitutions. I had played a role in this, as I think you know. I had been in Europe for 5 years, and I was not at Philadelphia. I was not in this country when the Constitution was written. But Madison prepared for more than a year to get ready for his historic work in Philadelphia, and he wrote to me and said, essentially, what do we know about Constitution writing? This is not something that's very well documented. We're really entering some uncharted ground here, Mr. Jefferson. How can you help me? And so I went to the bookstalls in Paris, which I love to do anyway, and I selected for him more than 80 books on the history of constitutions, going all the way back to Aristotle. And I sent those books, shipped those books over to Madison in Virginia and said, read these. And when you will have read these books, you will know what to do. And so I was the bibliographer for James Madison, and it's from that hard reading. He first wrote an analysis of the weaknesses of constitutions, and he wrote several long papers about this before he even got to Philadelphia. And so he was a very well-informed person, and my view is always that the most informed person in a room has more power than ostensibly more powerful people. But nobody was as prepared as James Madison, and that expertise, that mastery that he brought and that he had consolidated by writing out these long essays. In other words, it wasn't just what he'd read, but how he had applied it in these learned essays. This gave him more power than any other delegate to that convention. I think people were astonished by how well prepared he was and how much deep thinking he had done in all of these areas.
These journals of this convention are not what one would call really compelling reading, but they do offer a tremendous insight into what these delegates went through day to day and the minutiae of detail that they had to deal with, the decisions they had to make.
Of course, and remember that you've allowed the judiciary, the Supreme Court, to determine what is constitutional and what is not. That's a power I would not have given them, and frankly, that's a power that is not enumerated in Article 3 of the Constitution. But leaving that aside for the moment, your courts do weigh in on provisions. What does the Commerce Clause mean? What does the Necessary and Proper Clause mean? All of these questions are routinely brooded about and debated by the court systems, the federal court system in the United States, and particularly the Supreme Court, which in your time consists of 9 individuals, in my time 5 or 6. And when they come to a conundrum, the Constitution is rarely helpful because it's so stark. And so they go to the next best thing, maybe a better thing. They go to Madison's notes, and they say, well, at least we now know what they were debating. We know the different opinions about what's an impeachable offense. Madison gives them a context that's vitally needed, and they realize a couple of things. First of all, that the Constitution wasn't a unanimous document. There were serious disputes, and so any single clause had people who thought well of it, people who were indifferent to it, and people who despised it. And so those debates really help our courts understand the intentions. They're always trying to determine the intentions of the Constitution, and Madison is vital to that. But he also provides background. What's the hole that they were trying to patch? Just for example, determining what Congress can do was relatively easy, and you find their powers enumerated in Article 1. Determining what the president can do was exceedingly hard, and they didn't even decide on a single executive until very late in the game. There were people that wanted a plural executive. Franklin wanted 3. Other people wanted 12. How long should a president serve? Should he serve for life? Should he serve for 12 years or 4 years or 2 years or for a single year? They all were worried about presidents because presidents sort of rhyme with monarch and king. And so they wanted to make sure that the president had enough authority to do the things that a presiding officer should do, and was missing, by the way, in the articles. But they didn't want to create a monarchy either, and so they wrestled with this. And it wasn't until extremely late in the process that they finally, in a sense, gave up. It was by no means a widely held view, and produced a single president who would serve for 4 years and could be reelected as many times as the people would permit it, a provision later changed by constitutional amendment.
On September 17th, 1787, sir, 38 delegates signed the Constitution. John Jenkinson of Delaware was absent, but George Read signed for him, bringing the total number of signatures to 39. And as you say, amidst all of this, you were in contact with Madison, offering advice from your station in France. You wrote to Mr. Madison on September 6th, 1789, saying, "The question whether one generation of men has a right to bind another seems never to have been started either on this or our side of the water. Yet it is a question of such consequences as not only to merit decision, but place also among the fundamental principles of every government."
I had not been part of the process, so I looked at the document with fresh eyes. I received 3 copies of it from 3 members who had been there. As you remember, there was a secrecy pact, and I didn't like everything in it. And so I wrote about that, and Madison was, he wasn't angry, but I think he was frustrated by me because his view was, you weren't there, Mr. Jefferson. You don't know how hard this was. Because I had suggested maybe they go back for round 2 and maybe clarify a few things. And his view was there can be no round 2.
But you challenged his view that this could be considered a perpetual document.
it should not be a perpetual document. I did challenge it, and he refuted my arguments, and he refuted them very ably, by the way. But here's my point of view. All right, so they meet, right? They meet in Philadelphia, 55 of them, and they hammered this thing out over the course of the summer. It's now the social compact of the United States, if it's ratified, and it was ratified. So every state had a ratification procedure, varied from state to state. But in the end, every state ratified, even Rhode Island, although it came in several years later. So now you have a new social compact that has been devised by rational men, and now it has been ratified, explicitly ratified by the people. So that's the social compact. But what about their children and grandchildren? Their children weren't at the convention. Their children weren't at the ratification addresses. Their children inherited the Constitution. The people must explicitly consent to their form of government. My point is that if we believe in the consent of the governed, then we ought to believe in that for our children and their children and their children's children. And so there needs to be a sunset clause of some sort or a revisal clause in the Constitution so that we don't force it upon the unborn, because that would violate the very principle of consent of the governed. Now, Madison's view was there is an amendment process, which was not really true under the Articles, so that gives people a chance to revise their Constitution, and that one generation doesn't just happen on such and such a Thursday, that there's a continuum in human births and human deaths, so determining what consent is and what a generation is are very difficult things to do, and furthermore, continuity and stability matter in constitutions, and my view, he thought, was perhaps likely to create instability in our Constitution.
I thank you profusely for the conversation this week. I have learned so much from you, sir.
Let me just say that I came to terms with the Constitution. I liked it better over time. I assumed that we would fix anything that was imperfect in it as the nation progressed with better science and better information and a better understanding of the rights of man. And so I was less critical of it later than I was at the time, and Madison's refutation of my view that we should tear up the Constitution every 19 years didn't satisfy me, but I didn't quarrel with it after that either.
I thank you so very much, Mr. Jefferson. I look forward to our next conversation.
You are most welcome, sir.
We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll be joined by the gentleman who portrays President Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm now Clay Jenkinson, out of tights, and I've doffed my wig. My buckled shoes have been placed back under the bed. And I'm talking with my friend and my partner in the Jefferson Hour, the semi-permanent guest host, Mr. David Swenson. Sir, interesting topic. You chose it. Tell us why.
Mostly because of... it's come up in conversation and news stories recently. In fact, there was one by Jesse Wegman in the New York Times, an opinion piece titled, "Thomas Jefferson Gave the Constitution 19 Years. Look Where We Are Now." And that sort of spurred the idea on of talking to Mr. Jefferson. I don't think we really ever talked to him about the details of the convention. And then reading Madison's account of it, which it's an amazing achievement what these men did in that short period of time to create this new document that we now regard as holy scripture almost.
Perhaps too much. I think Jefferson was certainly right when he later said, "Some men look on constitutions with a kind of sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human and assume what they did to be beyond amendment." It's one of my favorite Jefferson quotations. I think he was right. I think today we have this really unfortunate reverence for the Constitution on all sides. So no matter what your politics, people are saying, why can't we be originalists? Why can't we go back to the original intent, what the founders had in mind? Well, the founders were white males of a certain property base, all sexists. They were slaveholders. They were people who believed in indentured servitude. They regarded Indians as savages and barbarians. They were racist with respect to African Americans and deeply patriarchal with respect to women. They had the 3/5 clause, which is an ugly compromise, counting every 5 slaves as 3 for the purposes of apportionment and representation. We are dramatically more enlightened in some, but not all respects, than were the Founding Fathers. And Jefferson's view was, get real. Your society is going to be the most progressive society in the world. Science, technology, demographics, social change. You need to keep your Constitution current with the progress of humanity. And we haven't done that. We've amended it only 27 times. That's not very often, especially if you consider the first 10 as the Bill of Rights, which were instantly proposed and ratified. So that's almost an addendum to the Constitution. That leaves 17. The last amendment, David, was 1992, and it was just about congressional salaries. The number of actual fundamental changes to the Constitution since the Bill of Rights is small. And Jefferson, looking at this, would say, and it shows. He would say, I don't know that I quarrel with your interpretations of the Constitution, but you shouldn't be tied to it. You should rewrite the thing so that it can be equal to your own dreams, your own needs, your own demographics, your own contingencies. And so I think Jefferson was right about that. I don't know that his mechanism of tearing up the Constitution every 19 years or so was the right mechanism, but in principle, I think he was absolutely right. And I think one of the biggest problems, and I'm part of it, I'm afraid to say, or we're part of it, my friend, is that by aggrandizing the Founding Fathers, we allow a certain element in American life to think that was the golden age, and we must go back to what the founders intended. That's the only hope for this country. And I think the only hope for this country is precisely the opposite of that, frankly.
You asked why I was drawn to this subject matter.
Yes.
Another piece that I read was by our good friend Lindsay Chervinsky, her latest
Ms.
blog.
Chervinsky.
Yes, on Imperfect Union, sort of a inflammatory title. Why quote, the framers never intended is garbage. She writes, if the framers, the men that wrote the Constitution, had agreed on everything, they would have all signed the document. They didn't. George Mason refused to sign the Constitution and published a pamphlet after the convention arguing that the states should refuse to ratify the proposed document. And then she talks about how hard George Washington took this and how it sort of ruined their friendship.
But also Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, refused to sign, which is bizarre, and his positions were never really clear. He's sort of a waffler amongst the Founding Fathers, both then and later when he was serving in the Washington administration cabinet. Patrick Henry had a chance to go to the Constitutional Convention. He refused, and I'm quoting him, he smelt a rat. He felt that the new government was going to swallow up states. And so there wasn't a unanimous view. But I disagree with Lindsay here. There was a near unanimous view. Most people signed it, and most people got on board. Nobody got exactly what they wanted, but they all sort of realized this is the best we're going to get. And we must. Hamilton said, it's this or what. This may not be perfect, but if 55 men working for 4 months, being unpaid, by the way, volunteering this for the good of the country, exempting themselves from their real lives, their real families, their real economies, and going off to a city where many were paying their own expenses. If these people produce this Constitution with all of this throwing about of debate and so on, then the alternative is national collapse. We better do this, and then we'll fix it as we go along. So I disagree slightly with Lindsay there, but I think that her other point is the right one, which is that this reverence we have, if we could only get back to the founders, well, A, who were the founders? I've said that they were white males of a great privilege. But secondly, they disagreed on most of these points. If you had gone to any one of them and said, okay, Mr. Mason, what's your Constitution? Okay, George Wythe, what would your Constitution have looked like? Hamilton, what would your Constitution have looked like? It would have been all over the map. Everyone came away frustrated. Almost nobody, and especially Madison, came away delighted. But they thought, that's about as good as we're likely to get here.
Another thing that I came across I found very interesting was in the introduction to the journals of the convention that Madison wrote, and it's instructions for after his death. And Dolly was given the rights to publish the journals and get paid for it. Are you aware of that?
I did not know that she made any money on this.
Quote, this provision bears evidence of the value Madison sat on his report of the debates in the convention, and he has charged legacies on them alone to the amount of $1,200 for the benefit of literary institutions and for benevolent purposes, leaving the residuary net proceeds for the use of his widow.
Good for her. You know, this was a problem that needed to be solved. We had no way of pensioning our former presidents. We had to find ways to compensate them or their widows and children, and it was highly imperfect. Jefferson should never have been allowed to be bankrupt at the end of his life, a man who served his country in that way, and yet there was simply no pensioning until much, much later in American history. So yes, there are books that people should read. You know, I do these constitutional courses, doing another
Right.
one in November.
I thought of that when I was preparing notes for this.
This one's going to be more organized along fixing it. You know, if we tried to go in and figure out how to clarify the emoluments clause or the pardon clause or the treason clause or the Second Amendment or the Fifth or the Ninth, what would we do? And so we'll look at the making of the Constitution, sort of along the lines of today, and the amendment process so far in American history. But then we'll say, well, what are the areas that really rational people, if they were meeting rationally, not in a partisan way, would want to address, and how might we sort of fix some things? That's going to be the nature of this course. People can go to the website and sign up whenever they want. But the book we used last time was Clinton Rossiter, 1787, The Grand Convention. That's a good book, but it's a little dated. There are some more recent books. There's Decision in Philadelphia, which is Christopher Collier. And then there's a really dated one, but it's excellent, by Catherine Drinker Bowen, called Miracle at Philadelphia. And that's been around for a long time, but it's actually a very well-written account. We'll put some of these on the website. And then we're going to read a book about proposed amendments, you know, the perceived weaknesses of the Constitution and how they might be fixed if we could get our act together.
Right. There is a provision in the Constitution which allows for calling a new constitutional convention, right?
Indeed, there is. And you know, we've never had it. We've gotten close a couple of times, but we've never actually done it. And the amendment process, one of the points I make in these courses, that the amendment process set the bar too high. You have to have 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress and signed by the president, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify the amendment. Well, trying to get 3/4 of 50 states to ratify any amendment whatsoever is virtually impossible in this age of partisan attacks. We've only had 27 amendments. Jefferson would have said we should have had 270 amendments by now. And so they set the bar a little too high. But when you start to think about lowering it, David, you don't want to lower it too much. You know, you want to make sure that you have something like a societal consensus approaching unanimity for changing your basic charter. But if you make it impossible to amend, that forces the courts to play such an active role in applying and interpreting the Constitution that then we think we have runaway court systems.
There was one thing that I did not get a chance to bring up with Mr. Jefferson this week, so I'll bring it up with you. And
Sure.
You know, he wrote a lot of important letters to Edward Carrington. There's one from the 27th of May, 1788. He talks about his worry of future presidents. He says, the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. As yet, our spirits are free. Our jealousy is only put to sleep by the unlimited confidence we all have in the person to whom we look to as our president. After him, inferior characters may perhaps succeed and awaken us to the danger which his merit has led us into. I thought that was really interesting.
There's so much that's there, David. Some inferior, what was it, inferior persons?
Inferior characters, which may perhaps succeed. He's talking about succeeding Washington, of course, and awaken us to the danger which his merit has led us to. In other words, everybody is solid with Washington. It's going to be great. But Jefferson says, well, just wait a minute. We don't know who's going to follow him. In fact,
Yes.
he did. So,
And he also said that in that first key line of that, David, you know, the tendency of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. You don't have to be a member of the Freedom Caucus or the Tea Party to realize how true that is, that if Jefferson or even Hamilton could look at our government and see how massive the national government is, how many things that it attends to, how much it regulates our lives, they would be appalled. Jefferson certainly wanted a minimalist national government, and he wanted to maintain the compact of semi-sovereign states as much as possible. He's a 10th Amendment man. The idea of our government, hyper-government in many respects, is an appalling adjustment. Now, we can say, of course, you have to make those adjustments when you have cruise missiles and jet airplanes and freeways and cyber terror, that the complexity of our world requires a government that Jefferson could not possibly have imagined. And I think that's certainly true. And I think that's the key mistake of the Tea Party types and the libertarians, is that they think, oh, let's just go back to the founders. Well, that's a world that doesn't have anthrax. That's a world that doesn't have nuclear weapons in it. We have a much bigger government than they could have contemplated, but we have an infinitely more complex society. But even so, Jefferson said, look, we start out with purity perhaps, but the tendency of things is for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield. And you could say, in some sense, if you tried to neutralize that and not make it a political statement, that that's the history of the United States. And maybe it's the inevitable history of modernity.
So we have Madison going through as heavy a workload as anybody at the convention. I think you would agree with that. And then Jefferson comes back and says, well, that's just great, but, we ought to rip it up every 19 years. And, it would be great to see Madison's face when he read that letter. Was there any actual response from Madison to Jefferson about this?
Oh, yes. He wrote back a magnificent letter eviscerating Jefferson's arguments. It's one of my favorite letters. So Jefferson says the world belongs to the living. We should tear up the Constitution every 19 years. No Constitution can be perpetual. And then Madison says, this is brilliant. This is the smartest thing I've ever read. You're absolutely right. Bravo, Mr. Jefferson. You nailed it. And then he says, but there are certain possible objections and inconveniences to your argument. And then he goes on to completely destroy Jefferson's point of view and to show that Jefferson is only right in some kind of a utopian world that's never going to exist. But he does it without offending the great man. He knows that he has to, he does agree with it in principle, of course, but he knows that he can't say, give me a break, Mr. Jefferson. He has to say, that was great, but here are a few little things that you might wish to factor into your thinking about this. And it's just absolutely a masterful letter. He did this a lot with Jefferson, but even more, you talk about Madison's consternation. In the Virginia ratifying convention, Jefferson's in Europe, Madison's trying to get this thing ratified. Patrick Henry leads the anti-Federalist attack on the new Constitution in this convention, in Madison's presence. And guess what he does? He quotes a letter from Thomas Jefferson condemning parts of the new Constitution.
Oh, my. We're going to have a conversation with Mr. Jefferson about that sometime in the future.
But you made the key point today, which is that there was no unanimity in Philadelphia. When you talk about the founders with that kind of air quotes around them, you have to remember that they barely squeezed this thing out with a lot of dispute and misgiving, and nobody got exactly what they wanted. And so to think that the founders had an intent is not to have come to terms with Madison's commentaries on the thing. And Madison's commentaries, he knew that this was not an occasional event, that this was a key moment in human history. This was a time in the modern world, in the Enlightenment world, when a rational people sat down and hammered out a social compact for themselves. That's not how it works in most times and in most countries even today. And that the whole world was watching, maybe not then, but historically the whole world would be watching, and they would want to know exactly what was deliberated behind those closed doors. And so he gave us that document. Today, of course, we'd have a verbatim transcript. But in some ways, his document was better because he was able slightly to polish all the arguments into rational prose. And so we owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. He was an okay president. He was the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights, James Madison.
But now, sir, we are out of time for this week.
This was a very interesting program, David. I so appreciate it. People can sign up for the Constitution courses. There'll be several of them over the course of this winter. It's an absolutely important discussion. And one of the things we need to talk about is the difference between the capital C Constitution, that's today's subject, and then the small c Constitution of norms and habits like filibuster, like cloture, like senatorial courtesy, like 9 members of the Supreme Court rather than some other number. Those are not constitutional provisions. Those are American norms, and they're equally potent with the capital C Constitution. So that's another discussion.
Very good, sir. And I thank you for a fine conversation this week.
We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.